The story of the SR-71's 1,842-knot speed check. There are moments in aviation that become legend. Stories passed down through generations of pilots, told in ready rooms and at air shows, stories that capture something essential about what it means to fly. This is one of those stories. It's about an SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built. It's about two crew members on a routine training mission over the western United States. And it's about a moment of pure satisfaction that any pilot would understand, but magnified to supersonic proportions. This is the story of the speed check heard round the world. To understand this story, you need to understand the airplane. The SR-71 Blackbird wasn't just fast, it was otherworldly. Designed by Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works in the 1960s, it could cruise at Mach 3+, above 80,000 feet, so high and fast that its standard defense against surface-to-air missiles was simply to accelerate and outrun them. No SR-71 was ever shot down by enemy fire. Flying the Blackbird required a special breed of pilot. The aircraft leaked fuel on the ground because the titanium skin was designed to expand at temperature. At cruise speed, friction would heat the aircraft's skin to over 600 degrees Fahrenheit, sealing those gaps. The cockpit windows would become too hot to touch. You wore a full pressure suit, essentially a spacesuit, because at that altitude, if something went wrong, you were operating in an environment that could kill you in seconds. Major Brian Schull was one of those pilots. A Vietnam veteran who had survived being shot down and suffering severe burns, he had fought his way back to flight status and earned his place in the SR-71 program. His reconnaissance systems officer, his RSO, sat behind him in the tandem cockpit. Together, they formed one of the most elite flight crews in military aviation. On this particular day, they were flying a routine training sortie across the American Southwest. The mission profile was standard, high-altitude reconnaissance simulation, practicing the procedures they would use in actual operations. From their perch above 70,000 feet, the curvature of the Earth was visible. The sky above transitioned from deep blue to black. Below, the continental United States spread out like a map, state boundaries invisible, mountain ranges and river systems defining the landscape instead. At these altitudes, they had the airspace largely to themselves. Commercial traffic operated in the flight levels far below, around 35,000 to 40,000 feet. Military training flights might venture up to 50,000 or 60,000 feet. But the Blackbird's operational ceiling was in a realm of its own. Like all aircraft, the SR-71 monitored the common air traffic control frequencies for its region. On this day, they were listening to the civilian ATC frequency used by general aviation and some military aircraft transiting the area, a frequency that covered everything from small Cessnas puttering along at a few thousand feet to military jets on training runs. The frequency had been relatively quiet, the typical periodic check-ins and routine communications. But then something started happening that would set up one of the most memorable moments in aviation storytelling. It started simply enough. A small single-engine airplane, probably a Cessna, called up the air traffic controller. The exchange was routine. "Center, how fast am I showing?" Now, you have to understand something about pilots. There's a certain pride in speed, especially for those flying high-performance aircraft. It's not arrogance, or at least, not entirely. It's the satisfaction of handling a powerful machine, of being part of that exclusive club that operates at the edge of what's possible. What happened next was a cascade, a sequence of calls that would build to an unforgettable crescendo. And the Blackbird crew. They were listening to every word. The first call came from the small single-engine plane, probably a Cessna 172 or something similar. These are training aircraft, reliable and steady, the kind of plane where student pilots learn the fundamentals. They cruise at maybe 100 to 120 knots on a good day. "Center, how fast am I showing?" the pilot asked. There was a brief pause. You could almost hear the controller checking his radar readout, and then the response came back. You're showing 90 knots across the ground. 90 knots. Just over 100 miles per hour. Respectable for a small trainer, particularly if there was a headwind. The pilot seemed satisfied with the answer. He acknowledged, and the frequency went quiet again. But something had been started. The question had been asked, and now it hung in the air, literally. Every pilot on that frequency had heard it. And more importantly, every pilot on that frequency now knew that the controller would answer that particular question. It didn't take long. Within a minute or two, another voice came on the frequency. This one had a slightly different tone, not the tentative quality of a student or low-time pilot, but someone with a bit more confidence. Center, how fast am I showing? This was likely a Beechcraft Bonanza or a similar high-performance single-engine aircraft. The Bonanza is a classic, a doctor's or businessman's airplane, fast and capable. Its pilots tend to take pride in the aircraft's performance. The controller's response came back, I have you at 120 knots. 120 knots. Nearly 140 miles per hour. A significant step up from the Cessna. You could almost hear the satisfaction in the Bonanza pilot's voice as he acknowledged the call. In the SR-71 cockpit, more than 10 miles above, Major Schull and his RSO listened. They had to be smiling behind their face masks. They knew what was building. They'd heard this kind of thing before, pilots comparing speeds, each one trying to one-up the previous call. But they also knew something else. They knew how this story was going to end. The frequency stayed quiet for perhaps 30 seconds. And then a new voice came on. This one was different. Sharper, more crisp. The unmistakable tone of a military fighter pilot. Center, I'm showing a little more speed here. Could you give me my ground speed? The phrasing was deliberate. Professional. But there was something there, a certain swagger that any aviator would recognize. This was an F-18 Hornet pilot, probably out of a naval air station, maybe on a cross-country navigation training flight or transitioning between bases. The F-18 is a formidable aircraft. Twin-engine, supersonic, the backbone of Navy and Marine Corps aviation. It's flown off aircraft carriers and can hold its own in any aerial combat scenario. And right now, this particular Hornet pilot was letting everyone know that he was playing in a different league than the small aircraft below. There was a slight pause, longer this time, as if the controller was savoring the moment too, and then the response, I show you at 520 knots across the ground. 520 knots. Nearly 600 miles per hour. Almost 5 times faster than the Cessna, more than 4 times faster than the Bonanza. The Hornet pilot had just put down an impressive number, and everyone listening knew it. The acknowledgement came back with barely suppressed satisfaction. Roger that, Center. Thank you. The frequency went quiet again. The one-upmanship seemed to have reached its conclusion. The F-18 had delivered the knockout blow. 520 knots was a speed that commanded respect, a number that the small aircraft below could only dream about. But high above, in the black sky where the atmosphere becomes space, Major Schull and his RSO were having a moment. They looked at each other, as much as you can in full pressure suits in separate cockpits. They didn't need to speak. They both knew. It was time. Now, here's something you need to understand about flying the SR-71 at cruise. The aircraft speed is classified, or at least it was during operations. Even ground speed, which is affected by winds and can vary, is sensitive information. SR-71 crews don't typically broadcast their speed over open frequencies. But this was different. This was training airspace over the continental United States. This was a moment of opportunity. And sometimes, just sometimes, the rules can bend a little for the sake of something memorable. Major Schull had been professional his entire flight. They had been cruising, probably not at maximum speed. They were over the United States, after all, not outrunning SAMs over denied territory. But they had the capability. They had the altitude. They had the airplane. And they had been listening to this entire sequence with growing amusement. The RSO in the backseat had to be thinking the same thing. They'd heard the Cessna's 90 knots. They'd heard the Bonanza's 120. They'd heard the Hornet's 520. And now the frequency was quiet, the competition seemingly over. But not quite. Because there was still one aircraft left to check in. Major Schull keyed his radio. His voice was calm, professional, with just the slightest hint of what was coming. Center, this is Aspen 20. Can you give us a ground speed check? Even the call sign was perfect, Aspen 20, the operational designation for an SR-71. Any controller who knew aviation would recognize it instantly. Any pilot who knew military aircraft would know exactly what was about to happen. There was a pause. In that moment, you can imagine the air traffic controller looking at his scope, seeing the data tag next to the radar return, seeing the ground speed readout. You can imagine him realizing what he was looking at, understanding the moment that was unfolding. You can imagine him smiling. When the response came back, the controller's voice carried a tone of pure satisfaction, the joy of someone who gets to deliver the punchline to a perfect setup. Aspen 20, I show you at 1,842 knots across the ground. 1,842 knots. Let that sink in for a moment.